Here we have a model of the human brain. Let's orient ourselves to it. This region, let me hold this like this. All of this region here is the cerebrum. There are two hemispheres, hemisphere here and hemisphere here, divided by the longitudinal fissure right here. Here we have the cerebrum with these gyri and sulci. These are the sulci, and the tissue is the gyrus. Here's this cerebellum that also have gyri and sulci right here. Let's go back to the cerebrum. The cerebrum has lobes. Here is the frontal lobe of the cerebrum, temporal lobe of the cerebrum, occipital lobe, and parietal lobe. There is one more fissure. There is a lateral fissure right here that is a deep groove that separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. Other general regions of the brain include the pons, this large bump here, the pons, which in life is not divided. Large bump is the pons. The medulla, this region right here, kind of tapers down. And then from about the probe down is the spinal cord. Okay. This is another model of the brain that I need at this point, but let's orient ourselves to this model. Here we find cerebrum, here's cerebellum, this is pons, this is medulla, and then down here is spinal cord. So it's essentially the same. But on this model we have the hypophysis or the pituitary gland, which is dangling from the base of the brain. It dangles from this white, on this model, this white little stick-like thing, which is the infundibulum. So here's the infundibulum, here's the hypophysis or pituitary gland, and we're back to the inferior surface of the human brain. We'll go back to the other model for the rest of the things. Okay. Next we have the mammillary bodies. In a human there are two. There's one white bump here, one white bump here. These are the mammillary bodies. Anterior to that is, on this model, a hole or a piece of wire that used to be the infundibulum. So the infundibulum that dangles the pituitary gland is right in this region on this model. Just slightly anterior to that we have the optic chiasma. You can see the optic nerve in this way. Optic nerve crossing here, so that's the optic chiasma. This is the inferior surface of the human brain. Now we have some structures on the dorsal surface we need to find, but we aren't able to see them just from the dorsal surface, because in this model I can't bend the cerebellum back and the cerebrum that way. But I can see them if I look at just half of this model's brain, half of the brain model. Here is the cerebrum, here is the cerebellum, and between them we found the four bumps that are the Corpora Quadrigemina. So right in this region, were I able to bend in between here and see it, I could see the bumps that make up the Corpora Quadrigemina, although I'm only looking at half of them now, so instead of four I can see two. This is the superior colliculus, this is the inferior colliculus. This little pink bump right here is the pineal body or the pineal gland. Now back to the inferior surface, let's find the peduncles. The peduncles formed a V on either side of the mammillary body. Here are the mammillary bodies, and here is the peduncle. Cerebral peduncle here, cerebral peduncle here. Thick swellings on either side of the mammillary body. All right. That takes care of the external brain. Here we find the corpus callosum, the roof of the lateral ventricle. Here's the fornix, the floor of the lateral ventricle. And here's a representation of the septum pellucidum, which is that thin membranous wall found between the two lateral ventricles. There is no representation on this model of the lateral ventricle. The lateral ventricle I could find if I could break through this wall and go down in there, I would see the lateral ventricle. So this is just the septum pellucidum that separates the two lateral ventricles. Here we have the thalamus, the egg-like structure. And here's the intermediate mass. And this groove right here around it represents the third ventricle. Below the thalamus is found the hypothalamus. All in this region right here is the hypothalamus. It includes the mammillary body. So the hypothalamus comes down about like that. I'm outlining it about like that. Including the mammillary body, not including the optic chiasma. Hypothalamus. Let's view the mammillary body from this view. Here it is. Here's the optic chiasma. We also have the pons and the medulla, and then we're down into the spinal cord. Pons, medulla, and spinal cord. Here is the cerebellum with the arbor vitae depicted here, the tree of life, arbor vitae. Between the cerebellum and the pons and medulla, we find the fourth ventricle. So here's the fourth ventricle. The gray matter, of course, is this darker tissue. White matter is seen here in the arbor vitae. Here we have the sheep brain covered by the dura mater. This is the dura mater, and I am putting the probe under the dura mater in the subdural space. Here, this brain has had the dura mater removed, and we are able to see this part of the brain is covered with the arachnoid mater. It's kind of like shrink wrap. If you can get close on the view here, and you can see that there's sort of a covering. As I run my probe over the sulci of the brain, the grooves are the sulci, I can't get the probe down into those grooves. I can't get them into the sulcus without penetrating this very thin cellophane-like, shrink wrap-like layer called the arachnoid mater. So here's the arachnoid mater covering this whole hemisphere of the brain. All right, on this side of the brain, in this hemisphere, we can see that the arachnoid has been removed. On this side, we can see sort of a filmy saran wrap layer, the arachnoid, and on this side, you can tell that it's been removed first by the fact that I can easily put the probe into the sulci without breaking through any membrane. Therefore, these gyri are covered by pia mater, which hugs the brain and extends on the gyrus down into the sulcus. So we have the arachnoid over here that you cannot get into the grooves, and over here you have the pia covering all these bumps of tissue known as gyri. We have some general regions of this brain you're responsible for. One is the cerebrum. The cerebrum is all of this here. All of this is cerebrum. Back here we have the cerebellum. Then if I turn the brain on the ventral side, we can see some other general regions. Here is the pons, and here is the medulla. Pons and the medulla oblongata, and then we're down into spinal cord down here. The cerebrum can be divided into cerebral hemispheres. Here is the right cerebral hemisphere, here is the left cerebral hemisphere, and there is a groove found between the two that is called the longitudinal fissure. A fissure is a deep groove. A more shallow groove we refer to as a sulcus. So here's one hemisphere, one cerebral hemisphere, here's another cerebral hemisphere. The cerebellum can further be divided into lobes. Here is the frontal lobe, here is the temporal lobe, right around in that region. Here is the occipital lobe, and in this region would be the parietal lobe, and of course it's the same on the other hemisphere. On the sheep brain, the lateral fissure is not well enough developed to point out. Okay. On the inferior surface of the sheep brain, we have several structures you're responsible for. One is the mammillary body, and I'm outlining the mammillary body here. Here is the mammillary body. This little structure right on the midline, and on a sheep brain there's only one. On the human there are two. So here's the mammillary body. Slightly anterior to that is a hole. I'm putting the tip of the probe in that hole. That is what remains of the infundibulum, which dangled the pituitary gland. Above that is what remains of the optic chiasma. This is the crossing of the optic nerve. The optic nerve extended out like that and like that. We had to cut those off in order to be able to expose this area. So before it was cut, we had an optic chiasma. On the dorsal side of the brain, we find some other structures of importance. To find them, I am going to bend the brain, separating the cerebellum from the cerebrum, and expose 1, 2, 3, 4 bumps. All 4 of those bumps together are known as the Corpora Quadrigemina, 4 bodies. Corpora Quadrigemina. The Corpora Quadrigemina is made up of 2 superior colliculi, 2 inferior colliculi. 1 colliculus, another colliculus, but all together these are known as the Corpora Quadrigemina. There's one further bump right here, this little one. That small one right there is the pineal body. Pineal gland, pineal body. Okay. Here we have the cerebral peduncles. Remember that the cerebral peduncles are found on the ventral side of the brain. We find them forming a V on either side of the mammillary body. They are swelling. Cerebral peduncles. Here's one, and here's another. On a brain that has been cut along the mid-sagittal section, we find some further structures. Here we have the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum, which forms the roof of the lateral ventricle. Here we have the fornix that forms the floor of the lateral ventricle. I can put my probe into the lateral ventricle right here. Corpus callosum, fornix, lateral ventricle. Now on this particular brain, you can see a small amount of septum pellucidum right there. Septum pellucidum dividing the 2 lateral ventricles. On this brain, let me point out those same structures. Here is the corpus callosum, fornix, lateral ventricle. On this brain, corpus callosum, fornix, and lateral ventricle. A little variation in appearance, but effectively the same structures. Next we have the thalamus. The thalamus is seen pretty well on this brain. It is directly inferior to the fornix. Here is the thalamus, this round structure right here. There's the thalamus. Here is the thalamus on this brain. Nice round structure. The intermediate mass is in this region right here. I can slip my pointer around it like that, but I won't ask that on the practical because it's too difficult to see on the sheep brain. It is in this region, right around the intermediate mass, that we find the 3rd ventricle. So the 3rd ventricle would be right there. Next we need to find the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is seen pretty well on this sheep brain. It is inferior to the thalamus. Here's the margin of the thalamus. It is this region right here. This is the thalamus. It includes the mammillary body. There's a cut through the mammillary body, and it goes anterior to, but not including, the optic chiasma. Here's the optic chiasma. So the hypothalamus is outlined right here. Hypothalamus, very important region of the brain. The Corpora Quadrigemina, cut sagittally, is seen here. Here is the inferior colliculus. Here is the superior colliculus, and of course there are 2 more on the other side of the brain. All 4 of them make the Corpora Quadrigemina, but cut sagittally, you can see the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. And here is the pineal body or pineal gland. One more time, here is the mammillary body cut sagittally, and here is the optic chiasma cut sagittally. Next we find the pons. Here's the region of the pons. You can recall that this is the pons. Now we can see that little bump right there. This region is the medulla, and then we're down into the spinal cord. Here is the cerebellum cut sagittally, and you can see an obvious white tree with some dark colored leaves on it. That tree is named Tree of Life, or Arbor Vitae. This is the Arbor Vitae right here, Tree of Life. Between the cerebellum and the medulla and pons is a cavity, and that is the fourth ventricle. The gray matter is this region here that appears darker, brownish, and the white matter is this region that appears lighter. The white matter contains all the myelinated fibers or tracts here. And I think that completes our sheep brain.